was sitting on my back deck in Kelowna, watching the sun go down over Okanagan Lake, holding a glass of the Pinot Noir I'd been saving for no reason in particular, when my phone buzzed, a number I hadn't seen in 11 years. I didn't answer. I set the phone face down on the armrest and kept watching the water turn orange, and then pink, and then a deep, bruised purple. I'd bought this house 14 months ago, cash. 4 bedrooms, a wraparound deck, a view that made people go quiet when they first walked outside. I'd earned every square foot of it. Not quickly, not easily, and not with anyone's help. My son knew that. He just didn't care until it mattered to him. Let me go back to the part most people skip over because they want to get to the revenge. But the part that comes before, the quiet, grinding 11 years of it, that's the part that made everything else possible. My name is Walter. I'm 63 years old. I worked for 22 years as an electrician, then spent another decade building a small electrical contracting company from a used van and 3 hand tools I bought at a garage sale in Penticton. At my peak, I had 14 employees and contracts with 3 commercial developers in the Okanagan Valley. It wasn't glamour. It was early mornings and back pain and estimates that sometimes went wrong and jobs where clients moved the goalposts halfway through. But it was mine, and I was good at it. My son, Bradley, was never interested in any of that. That was fine. You don't build something so your children are obligated to love it. He studied business in Vancouver, met a woman named Serena in his second year, and by 26 they were married. I flew out for the wedding. I gave them a check for $15,000 as a gift, which was not nothing for me at the time. The first 2 years were fine. We spoke on the phone, visited at Christmas. Serena was polished in a way that made me slightly uneasy, the way a very clean kitchen makes you wonder if anyone actually cooks in it. But she was pleasant to me. Attentive even. She asked questions about the business with what seemed like genuine interest. Then Bradley got a promotion at a wealth management firm, and something shifted. Not all at once, it never is with this kind of thing. It's a degree at a time, like a room slowly getting colder. They moved to a new neighborhood in North Vancouver. The calls became shorter. When I visited, Serena had a way of making me feel like I'd arrived at the wrong door. Comments about my truck needing a wash. A barely there frown when I reached for the wrong fork at dinner. Once, she told Bradley, loud enough for me to hear, that she found it exhausting when people couldn't follow simple table conversation. I asked Bradley about it privately after that visit. He told me I was being too sensitive, that Serena was under stress at work, that I needed to understand her world was different from mine. That was the first time I understood what was actually happening. The last time I spoke to my son for what would become 11 years was at my wife Paulette's funeral. She died in March of 2014, pancreatic cancer, 6 weeks from diagnosis to the end. Bradley came for the service with Serena. He held my arm at the graveside and cried, but Serena spent most of the reception on her phone, and 2 weeks after I buried my wife, Bradley called to tell me that he and Serena felt it would be healthier for everyone if we took some space. I didn't argue. I was too tired. And grief, real grief, takes up so much room that there isn't space for much else. I drove back to Penticton. I went back to work. And slowly, over the next several years, I built something I hadn't expected to build. A friend of mine, a fellow named Gord, who'd retired early from the trades, had started converting his old apple orchard into a short-term rental property. He put 2 cabins on it, listed them online, and within 8 months had a waiting list from May to October. He told me I should do something similar. I told him I didn't have an orchard. He told me that was beside the point. I sold the contracting company in 2019, bought a rundown motel on the edge of Summerland, 12 units, ugly as sin, priced low because nobody wanted the project. I spent the better part of a year renovating it myself, doing as much of the electrical and general work as I could. I repurposed it as a boutique adults-only property with a small wine country theme. I called it the Thistle and Vine. The name came from nothing in particular, just felt right. Did well. Better than well. By 2022, it was featured in 2 travel publications. A journalist from Toronto called it quietly magnificent. I hired the manager, expanded to a second property near Oliver, added a third in Osoyoos. By the time I bought the house in Kelowna, my portfolio was worth just over $4 million, and generating income I still couldn't quite believe was mine. I haven't told Bradley any of this. There was no channel to tell him. He was gone. The call came on a Wednesday in July. Then a text. The next morning, Dad, it's Bradley. I know it's been a long time. Can we talk? I stared at it for about 10 minutes. Then I put my phone in my pocket and drove to the property in Oliver to check on a plumbing issue I'd been meaning to look at. He called again that Friday. I let it go to voicemail. His voice on the message was careful. Not warm, exactly, but rehearsed in the direction of warmth. He said he'd been thinking about me. He said some time had passed. He said he and Serena would love to come visit if I was open to it. I noticed he didn't say sorry, not in that message, and not in the 3 that followed over the next 2 weeks. I called him back on a Tuesday afternoon. I kept my voice neutral. Asked him how he was. He said, fine. He asked how I was. I said I was, well. There was a long pause, and then he said he'd heard from someone. He didn't say who, that I'd done well for myself. That I had a nice place out in Kelowna. I said yes, I did. He said it would mean a lot to them to reconnect. That Serena had grown a lot in the past few years. That they had a daughter now. Lily, she was 9. And that Lily had been asking about her grandfather. That landed somewhere in my chest that I wasn't prepared for. A granddaughter, 9 years old. I did the math without wanting to. I'd missed her entire life. I told Bradley I'd think about it. He said he understood. I called my lawyer that same afternoon, a woman I'd worked with for years on the business side, Kathleen Mercer, sharp and unhurried, and the kind of person who doesn't react to things until she has the full picture. I told her what was happening. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "What do you want to do?" I said I didn't know yet, but I wanted to be ready for whatever they came with. She told me to document everything. She told me to get a clear understanding of my assets and make sure nothing was accessible without my explicit authorization. She reminded me gently that love and legal exposure were not the same thing, and that grief, even old grief, even justified grief, could make people do things that weren't in their own interest. I thanked her. I hung up, and then I sat with it for 3 more days before I called my son back. They arrived on a Saturday in August. Bradley was 40 now. He put on weight in the way that men in financial services often do, softly, expensively. He wore a linen shirt that probably cost more than my first set of tools. Serena had the same quality of surface she'd always had, immaculate and impenetrable, but there was something tighter around her eyes than I remembered. And then there was Lily. She hung back by the car door when they pulled up. Small for 9, dark-haired, watching me the way children watch people they've been told to trust but aren't sure about yet. I crouched down when I walked over. I said, "You must be Lily. I've been looking forward to meeting you." She looked at me very seriously and said, "Grandpa, your house is really big." I laughed for what felt like the first genuine time in months. We had dinner on the deck. Bradley and I talked around things, the way you do. He asked about the properties, and I gave him a modest version. Enough to confirm I'd done well. Not enough to reveal the shape of it. Serena was pleasant. She complimented the wine. She said the view was extraordinary. Lily spent most of dinner asking me if I liked dinosaurs and whether I'd ever seen a bear. That night, after Lily was in bed, Bradley and I sat on the deck with 2 glasses of rye. He asked how everything was structured, the business. I said Kathleen handled most of the operational oversight, that it was a fairly tight LLC structure. He nodded like he understood, and I could see the part of him that was doing arithmetic. "You know," he said, "with your portfolio size, you probably benefit from a different kind of financial management. More sophisticated diversification." I said I'd managed all right so far. He said wealth management at scale was different, that he had access to vehicles most people didn't know existed, that he'd love to take a look at my situation as family, not as a client. I said I appreciated the thought. Serena came out then and touched Bradley's shoulder in a way that looked like a signal. He smiled and said, "We didn't have to talk business tonight. That was for another time." I poured us each another finger of rye and changed the subject to hockey. They stayed 4 days. On the second day, Serena asked to see the full house. I gave them a tour. She asked detailed questions about square footage, the year it was built, whether I'd had it appraised recently. She said something about how it would be such a shame if a place this size was ever just sitting empty. On the third day, Bradley suggested that given my age and the fact that I was managing multiple properties without family nearby, it might make sense for them to consider relocating from Vancouver. To be closer. To help. I said Kelowna was a long way from their lives. He said people's priorities change. That evening, after they'd gone to bed, I sat on the deck alone and thought about Lily. She'd spent that afternoon showing me a drawing she'd done of the lake. She'd asked me twice if I was going to come to her birthday party in October. There was nothing calculated in her. She was just a kid who'd been told she had a grandfather, and she was willing to take that at face value. I held onto that separately from everything else. On the morning they were leaving, Serena lingered in the kitchen while Bradley loaded the car. She said, quite directly, that they'd been thinking about Lily's future, about schooling costs and housing in Vancouver, and that given the assets I had sitting in real estate, it might make sense to look at restructuring things with family interests in mind. She said a family trust, properly set up, could benefit everyone. I looked at her for a moment. Then I said I'd have to talk to Kathleen about anything like that. Something moved across her face, very briefly. She smiled and said, "Of course." They came back 6 weeks later, without calling first. I was at the Oliver property when my property manager in Kelowna texted me that a car was in my driveway. I drove back, pulled in to find Bradley and Serena on the deck with 2 suitcases and a box of groceries like they'd already decided. Lily was not with them. I asked what was going on. Bradley said they'd had some difficult news, that his position at the firm was being restructured, that their mortgage in North Vancouver had gotten complicated, that they needed somewhere to land, just temporarily, while they sorted things out. I said, "How long is temporarily?" Serena said they were thinking a few months, just until Bradley found his footing professionally. She was already pulling open the sliding door like it was a given. I stepped in front of her. I said, "I didn't invite you." The way she looked at me in that moment, there was no more pleasant surface, just the real thing finally visible. She said, "Surely I didn't expect them to go to a hotel, that I had 4 bedrooms, that I was his father." I said I was aware of all of those things. Bradley put his hand on my arm and said, "Let's not make this into something it isn't." He said they be out of my hair. He said family takes care of family. I looked at my son, and I thought about a graveside in March 11 years ago. About 2 weeks of silence after I buried his mother. About a voicemail that said we need some space and then nothing. For a decade, until he heard I had money. I said, "I'm going to ask you to leave, today." What followed was not quiet. Bradley said I was being cruel, that I was punishing him for decisions both of them had made when they were younger and less mature, that he was asking for help, which is what families do. Serena said that if I refused to help my own son in a crisis, I should ask myself what kind of man I was. I went inside. I called Kathleen. I told her what was happening and asked if she could send a letter, formally, addressed to both of them, confirming that I had no obligation to provide housing and that any attempt to access or encumber my property without consent would be treated as trespass and fraud. She said she'd have it in their hands by Monday. When I came back outside, I said, "I've spoken with my lawyer. You'll receive a letter this week." For now, I need you to take your bags and go." Bradley looked like I'd hit him. Serena had the blank, recalibrating expression of someone who just realized a plan wasn't going the way she'd mapped it. They left. I stood on the deck for a long time after the car disappeared. What I did next is the part I need to explain, because from the outside, it might look like I just cut them off and moved on. That's not what happened. I called my son back 3 days later. Not to capitulate, not to apologize. I called because of Lily, and because I needed to separate those two things clearly in my own mind. I told Bradley I would not have him and Serena living in my house under any circumstances. I told him that was firm and final, and that my lawyer would enforce it if necessary. But I also told him that Lily was my granddaughter, and that whatever the state of things between us, I didn't want her to grow up not knowing me because of mistakes the adults in her life had made. There was a long silence. Then he said, "You're really not going to help us?" I said, "I'm not going to give you my house." He hung up. Serena called the next morning. She said that without help from family, they might have to remove Lily from private school. She said it would be unfortunate if Lily asked why her grandfather had refused to help and what she was supposed to say. She said some things about my character that I'll leave out. I let her finish. Then I said, "If you use Lily as a bargaining chip again, I'll be speaking with a family lawyer about access, and I'll have documentation of everything you said to me in the last 6 weeks. I'd think carefully about the next move." She hung up. I did not hear from them for 4 months. In that time, I talked to Kathleen regularly. She helped me formalize several things, not because I expected a legal fight, but because I wanted clarity. My will was already structured, but we reviewed it carefully. Everything was documented. Nothing could be touched without my signature and my signature alone. I also quietly hired someone to do a basic background search on Bradley's professional situation, not to harm him. I want to be clear about that, but because I learned the hard way that people in financial distress make decisions they wouldn't otherwise make, and I wanted to know what I was dealing with. What came back was sobering. Bradley had not just been restructured out of a role, he'd been separated from his firm following a compliance investigation. The details were not public, but there was enough in the pattern to understand that the financial pressure they were under was significant, and partly of their own making. In November, I got an email from Bradley, formal, almost corporate in tone. It said that he and Serena had retained a lawyer and were exploring whether there was a legal basis for claiming support given their circumstances and my resources, that they believed family obligations had a moral and potentially legal dimension. I forwarded it to Kathleen without comment. She wrote back, "Let me handle this, don't respond." I didn't. What Kathleen did over the next 6 weeks I won't describe in full because it would take longer than any of this. But she is very good at her job, and the combination of clear documentation, a professionally worded response, and the evident absence of any legal leverage on their part brought things to a relatively quick conclusion. They did not pursue any claim. The lawyer's letter they sent turned out to be what Kathleen called a pressure letter, designed to frighten rather than litigate. She'd seen 100 of them. What I did in December surprised even me. I sent Bradley a message. Short. I told him I knew about the compliance issue. I told him I wasn't going to use it against him. And I told him that if he ever decided he wanted a real relationship, not built on what I had, but on who we actually were, the door was not completely closed, but that it was a door he'd have to walk through on his own terms, without Serena doing the navigating. I told him that Lily had my number, and that if she ever wanted to visit, or if he wanted to bring her to see the lake sometime, that was a separate conversation that I was genuinely open to. He didn't respond. It's been 8 months since then. I had a strange Christmas, good food, a glass of something excellent, a long walk along the water in the thin December light. My property manager and her family came for dinner. A couple of old friends from Penticton drove over. It was quiet, and it was real, and it was mine. In February, I got a text from a number I didn't recognize. It said, "Hi, Grandpa, it's Lily. Mom doesn't know I'm texting. Can I come see the lake this summer?" I sat with my phone in my hand for a minute. Outside the window, the Okanagan was gray and still, the way it gets in winter, patient in a way that landscape sometimes is when you're not. I wrote back, I would love that more than anything. We can figure out the details whenever you're ready. She sent back a drawing she'd taken a picture of, a house on a lake, two stick figures standing on a deck. One taller, one small, both of them looking at the water. I put the phone down and stood at the window for a long time. I don't know what comes next with Bradley. Maybe nothing. Maybe someday something. That's his to decide, not mine. I spent 11 years waiting for someone to acknowledge what they'd done, and at some point you understand that waiting is just a different way of giving someone power over you. I'm not waiting anymore. But Lily is a different story, and it's one I'm planning to be around for. There's a moment I keep coming back to. Not the moment I told them to leave. Not the letter from Kathleen or the silence that followed. It's the moment Lily handed me her drawing through a phone screen, a house, a lake, two stick figures standing on a deck, and I realized that the thing I'd been most afraid of losing was still there, waiting the whole time. I spent a long time thinking that what happened to me was mainly about betrayal, and it was for a while. But somewhere in those 11 years of building the thistle and vine, of crawling under subfloors in Summerland and reworking estimates at 2 in the morning and figuring out what a burned-out electrician could actually become if he paid attention, I stopped being defined by what Bradley and Serena had done to me. I became defined by what I chose to do instead. That's the part nobody talks about when they tell these kinds of stories. Everyone wants to get to the part where the people who wronged you finally see what they threw away. And yes, there is something real in that. I won't pretend there wasn't a part of me standing on that deck, watching their car pull out of my driveway, that didn't feel the particular cold satisfaction of a man who'd been underestimated for a very long time. But that feeling passes. What stays is something quieter. What stays is the understanding that integrity isn't the performance. It doesn't happen in the dramatic moments. It happened for me in the small ones. The contracts I honored when I could have walked away. The employees I kept on through a slow winter when it cost me. The decision to call Kathleen before I let grief make choices on my behalf. That's what I mean when I say I try to do things the right way. Not perfectly, but honestly. And intelligence. The kind that actually matters. Isn't about being the smartest person in the room. Serena was smart. She could read a situation, calculate an angle, move pieces around a board. But she confused cleverness for wisdom. And that's a mistake that tends to compound over time. What got me through wasn't cleverness. It was paying attention, listening to people I trusted, understanding that the documents I signed and the structures I built weren't just legal protection. They were the architecture of a life I was choosing deliberately, not one being handed to me or taken from me. The part that took the longest was the endurance. Not the dramatic kind, not gritting your teeth through a single hard moment. The quiet, unglamorous kind. Going back to work the week after Paulette died. Buying that ugly motel in Summerland when every sensible person would have said it wasn't worth the trouble. Waiting. For 11 years without bitterness eating me hollow. I didn't always manage that last part gracefully. But I managed it. Lily is coming to Kelowna in July. She wants to see if there are actually bears. I've already looked up what 9-year-olds like to do around the lake. That's what I'm thinking about now. Not Bradley, not Serena, not the letter or the compliance investigation or any of it. Just the lake in July. And a kid who drew 2 stick figures on a deck and thought to send it to her grandfather. Some things, if you hold them carefully enough, survive everything.